After the disastrous PC port of The Last of Us Part 1, Iron Galaxy is back, this time teaming up with Nexus for the sequel, The Last of Us Part 2, and the goal is to deliver a much better experience and more polished PC version this time around. And while they barely managed to hit that mark, some decisions still get in the way. If you remember, the first game compiled shaders in the main menu, a process that took a long time to complete. To avoid this, The Last of Us Part 2 pre-compiled shaders for each level in the menu and also asynchronously during gameplay each time the player reaches a new area, which can lead to high CPU usage and inconsistent performance during these moments. And this completely defeats the purpose of pre-compiling shaders in the first place. And personally, I'd much rather wait several minutes in the main menu than deal with bad frame pacing during gameplay. Visually, The Last of Us Part 2 looks great with some of the best pre-baked lighting you'll see in a game. However, at its core, it's still a 5-year-old PS4 game, but despite that, it remains surprisingly demanding on the GPU. Thankfully, the graphics menu is extensive and offers plenty of flexibility and options to balance visuals and performance. But before diving into these settings, let's start with image quality, where more issues begin to appear. The quality of DLSS in this game is not as good as expected. In terms of stability, DLSS exhibits a lot of shimmering, especially in indirectly lit areas. Additionally, all three upscalers show noticeable aliasing on the ground, as you can see here. This may appear to be a problem related to texture filtering, but it's actually caused entirely by the upscalers. And generally, no matter which upscaling option you choose, shimmering remains a significant issue in this game, but those with an RTX GPU can use the newer DLSS transformer model, which significantly help reducing the ground aliasing, as you can see here. And while it does not completely eliminate shimmering, it still delivers a cleaner image and better motion clarity compared to the old CNN model, and I highly recommend it if you have an RTX GPU. Even at native resolution, shimmering is still visible across all options. DLAA is slightly more stable, but it looks softer in motion compared to FSR3AA or XeSS. And interestingly, when comparing DLAA to the transformer quality DLSS, the new model looks comparable and even better on some aspects than the old DLAA, while also delivering higher performance. This is yet another reason why I recommend using the transformer model in this game. And finally, here's a quick look at how disabling anti-aliasing or using SMAA compares to TAA on both image quality and performance. Now I'd like to talk about few settings that either aren't functioning as intended or I might be testing them in the wrong place. The first one is dynamic screen space shadows, which is supposed to enhance shadows from dynamic lights. But after testing this setting across multiple areas and cutscenes, I couldn't find any noticeable difference, either visually or in terms of performance. The second is real-time cloud shadow reflections, and whether this setting is enabled or disabled, shadows from clouds appear on reflections with no measurable impact on performance. The last setting here is Refraction Quality, which should control the quality of the light bending effect on translucent materials. But after checking various surfaces like glass, as you can see here, or water, I did not notice any difference in visuals or performance. So for these settings, I recommend keeping dynamic screen space shadows and real-time cloud shadow reflections enabled, and setting Refraction Quality to high just to stay on the safe side. And if I discover any visual or performance impacts from these settings later on, I'll leave comparison images in a pinned comment below the video. And with that out of the way, let's move on to level of detail, starting with dynamic objects level of detail, which controls the LOD of interactable and movable objects like these vehicles, with medium showing the biggest visual improvement while very high does not add much. And performance-wise, at least in this scene, there is no significant impact between the options, so for this one I recommend high. Next up is character's level of detail, which works similarly to the previous setting but for characters, and it has the biggest visual impact on crowded areas like here. In terms of performance, going from low to high costs around 6%, but going to very high comes at a massive cost of around 25%. So for this one I recommend high. And the last setting in this section is environment's level of detail, which mostly affects trees and vegetation as you can see here. And similar to the previous setting, there is a small performance cost when going from low to high, but increasing it further to very high comes with a hefty impact of around 32%. So for this one I recommend medium or high. Moving on to texture quality, and the first setting here is dynamic objects texture quality. Visually with the 8GB 3060 Ti, I did not notice any significant difference even when closely inspecting various dynamic objects. However, there is an increase in VRAM usage when raising this setting, so for 8GB GPUs I recommend keeping this one at medium. Next we have character's texture quality, and here we can see a slight visual improvement when going from low and medium to high and very high. But as you can see here, there is a significant increase in VRAM demand when stepping up to the higher options. So again, for 8GB GPUs, I recommend keeping this one at medium. The next one is environment's texture quality, and out of all these texture quality settings, this one has the most noticeable visual impact as you can see here. Because of that, it should take priority over the others when allocating VRAM, therefore I recommend keeping it at high. And the last setting here is visual effects quality, which controls the resolution and quality of visual effects textures as you can see here. And VRAM usage remains relatively unchanged between the options, at least in this area. That said, I still recommend keeping this setting at medium or high for 8GB GPUs just to be safe and to avoid any potential VRAM strain in areas with heavier visual effects. Moving on to texture filtering, and here increasing the filtering quality from bilinear to 16x anisotropic can cost up to 6%, but despite the cost, I recommend keeping this one at 16x. Let's move on to shadow quality, starting with Spotlight's shadow resolution. Spotlights make up the majority of artificial light sources in this game, and this setting controls the resolution and sharpness of shadows cast by spotlights, and performance-wise it has a negligible impact, so I recommend keeping it at high or very high. Next we have point light's shadow resolution. Unlike spotlights which project light in a specific direction, point lights emit light in all directions, and as you can see here, this setting controls the resolution and sharpness of shadows cast by these light sources. In terms of performance, it has no significant impact, so I recommend keeping it at high or very high. Moving on to ambient shadows, this one adjusts the resolution and quality of the capsule shadows used to ground characters in indirectly lit areas like here. Additionally, turning off these shadows also disables the approximated reflection of the character on certain rough reflective surfaces. And here we can see that medium exhibits noticeable shadow flickering, unlike high or very high. Performance-wise, there is around 2% when moving from low to high and around 4% when going up to very high. So for this one, I recommend high or very high. Directional shadow resolution adjusts the quality of the shadows from the sun and moonlights, and here both low and medium result in a significant drop in shadow quality, and performance-wise there is around 5% impact even when going from low to very high. So similar to the previous shadow settings, I recommend keeping this one at least at high. And the last setting here is directional shadow distance, which adjusts the draw distance of shadows cast by the sun or moonlights. Here we can see that this setting primarily affects mid to high range shadow maps, with no noticeable visual difference when going from medium to very high. And this is more obvious here, where even at very high, the highest quality shadow maps still load close to the camera. In terms of performance, at least in this scene, the impact is negligible. However, since very high does not offer any noticeable visual benefits, I recommend keeping this one at medium just as a safe choice. Let's move on to screen space shadows, starting with screen space shadows quality. This one enables screen space shadows, which help capture small objects and fine details that traditional shadow maps often miss. And increasing this setting improves the coverage and quality of these shadows, as you can see here. In terms of performance, there is a noticeable impact only when going up to very high, with around a 7% drop. Therefore, I recommend keeping this one at high. Next we have contact shadows, which adjust the resolution of self-shadowing on characters, as you can see here. Visually there is little to no difference between high and very high, and the performance impact is also negligible. Therefore I recommend keeping this one at high. Moving on to image-based lighting. This is the main technique responsible for handling specular effects and reflections in the game, and turning it off significantly compromises visual quality, removing most specular highlights and reflections. In terms of performance, the cost ranges from around 4% in a scene like this to up to 7% in more complex scenes like this one. But regardless of the cost, I highly recommend keeping this setting enabled. Let's move on to bounced lighting. This one enables local bounced lighting, which simulates indirect light by coloring nearby surfaces based on the color of the surface the flashlight is shining on. And it looks great and enhances the realism, but it comes at a significant performance cost of around 10%. So generally I recommend keeping this one enabled because it's tied to the flashlight, and it's most noticeable indoors where performance is usually better, and this 10% cost may not be noticeable in most cases. However, if you're struggling with performance even in indoor areas, you may want to consider disabling it. Next we have ambient occlusion. Visually, ambient occlusion in this game isn't as pronounced or impactful as in some other titles, but it's still necessary and helps add in more depth to the scene. Fortunately, it does not have a significant impact on performance, so keep it at quality. Moving on to screen space reflections, and there is no need to go into details for this one. I have tested multiple scenes with all SSR settings cranked up to high, and I did not notice any significant performance impact, so keep screen space reflections at high. Let's move on to real-time reflections quality. This one controls the resolution of planar reflections, which are used on certain reflective surfaces like mirrors, as you can see here. In terms of performance, going from low to high costs around 4%, while going up to very high increases the cost to 10%. So for this one I recommend high. Next we have screen space subsurface scattering. This one simulates how light penetrates and scatters through character's skin, as you can see here, and it doesn't seem to have any noticeable impact on performance, so I recommend keeping it enabled. Moving on to particle density, this one is self-explanatory and affects the density of particles on some specific scenes like this one. At low, most particles are disabled, and there is no significant visual improvement when going from medium to high and very high. Performance-wise, at least in this scene, there is around 2 to 3% cost when going from low to the higher options. So for this one, I recommend medium as a safe choice. Let's move on to volumetric effects quality. This one adjusts the resolution of volumetric effects such as light shafts, as you can see here. In terms of performance, there is a noticeable impact only when going up to very high, which adds around a 6% performance cost. I also noticed that in certain areas, switching from high to very high results in a significant momentary performance drop, possibly due to VRAM limitations. Therefore, I recommend keeping this one at high. Lastly, let's examine some post-processing and personal preference settings, starting with depth of field. This effect doesn't have a significant performance impact during cinematics, as you can see here, or during gameplay. So if you like it, don't worry about performance and keep it enabled. And the same goes for lens flare, which doesn't seem to impact performance much either. And finally we have field of view, which is surprisingly demanding in this game. Here I measured around a 9% performance cost when going from -10 to 0 and 15% when going to 10, so keep an eye on your performance before increasing the FOV too much. So given everything we've discussed so far, these are my recommended settings for The Last of Us Part 2. Now let's compare the performance of the optimized settings against the very high preset at 1440p with DLAA. And I also added quality DLSS 4 to the comparison. In this scene we can see on average around 27% performance increase when going from very high preset to optimized settings. But I don't recommend using the old DLAA, especially if you have a GPU like the 3060 Ti. Because here in a more demanding scene, the optimized settings show an even more significant gain, about 39% improvement, but maintaining 60 FPS is still not possible. That's why DLSS 4 in quality mode is a better choice, as it offers comparable or even better image quality while delivering substantially better performance. And with that we arrive at the end. Thank you so much for watching and for your time. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and if not, leave a dislike. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for future videos, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.